John Roos was a longtime friend of mine. He entered the Air Force in 1952 and retired as a colonel in 1982. He became the executive director of an association of CPAs. That's a little far cry from the Air Force, but that's what he started doing after he retired. He did that in 1984, and he retired from that in 1996. He's been a docent at the Air and Space Museum and the Udvar Hazy Museum since 1996. In the Air Force, he flew over 7,000 hours in 28 different types of aircraft and had 2 tours in Vietnam, with the last tour being the director of the Airborne Battle Staff for evacuation in 1975. Thank you for being a guest on our Village in Motion today, John.
Thank you for having me.
Well, 70 years ago today, I was an airman in the 4th Fighter Wing out at Andrews Air Force Base, or it's Andrews Airfield, I think, at the time. And at this time of the day, 70 years ago, I was a little apprehensive about the parade we were going to march in that afternoon. Something about the Air Force was going to be the U.S. Air Force instead of the Army Air Force. I must admit, I don't remember understanding the significance of the parade. Today, maybe during our conversation, John's going to tell us why it was significant. But first, let us talk a little bit about the early military organizations. How did we first use air, John? How did we get involved in air?
Well, of course, air, where does air start from? Besides the ballooning, using balloons, which of course were used for observation at one point.
Even in the Civil War, as I recall.
Civil War, right. Thaddeus, they came up with the balloon idea. They used them, and Grant liked them, Lincoln liked them, because they were an observation platform. And then from then, you go to the Wright brothers, and then they're coming up with an airplane in 1903. And then in 1908, they came to, at Fort Myers, Virginia, to sell an airplane to the government, and unfortunately it crashed, and Lieutenant Selfridge, who was a passenger, first passenger killed in the aircraft accident. Then, of course, they fixed that up, came back in 1909, and passed with flying colors and sold the airplane for $30,000 to the U.S. government, which was quite an accomplishment. And now, what do you do with an airplane?
Well, that's a good question. I would think now we invented the airplane, the U.S. Well, World War I comes along, and I presume that we have some great aircraft for World War I, huh?
We had none.
We had none.
Right.
And why didn't we have any?
Well, the primary reason was the Wright brothers had got into suits with anybody who was not following their method of steering an airplane, controlling an airplane, and especially in what they call the aileron problems, twisting and turning. Is that the same as twisting a wing? Warping a wing was the patent that they had. So therefore, they started suing everybody who were using ailerons, and people said, "Hey, it's not worth it, so we're not going to do anything."
But that didn't apply to the other nations, did it? France,
they
Britain,
tried to, but how do you sue across the ocean? It's pretty hard, I guess, and they just blew it off. And by this time, when they really started going, they were in war in Europe. Yeah. And they started early in Europe, and consequently, we never had an airplane go in. And to get into the war, although we had pilots flying, we had to use foreign airplanes.
Yeah, we might take a look at a few of the early aircraft.
Sure.
If we could see the first 6 pictures. The first one there shows a plane with the U.S. markings on it. You want to describe them, John?
Well, that's right there is a SPAD, excellent airplane.
Which was British. Yeah?
No, SPAD was a French airplane, Société pour les Aviations d'Essai Dérive, SPAD, and really a good airplane. Eddie Rickenbacker got most of his kills in that airplane.
Ah, okay. Next figure.
And that's the Jenny, the famous Jenny, which was we were going to use in World War II if we could get it into production fast enough. However, it didn't really get in production fast enough, and consequently didn't enter the war. But it became a great barnstorming airplane after the war.
Next.
That's an RAF airplane.
Right.
You can tell by the rondelles on the wing. That was a lot of problems also. The rondelle was always red, white, and blue with all Allied forces, and of course the way you picked one airplane over the other, if it had a red center, it was Brits, a blue center was French, and a white center was American.
Oh, next one. That's French.
That's a French airplane. You notice on the Indian head on the side, that's from the Lafayette Escadrille.
And the machine gun is above the propeller.
Machine guns above the propeller because they had not yet at that point discovered how to fire a bullet through propeller.
I think we have now a couple more, the German aircraft.
And they had learned, the Germans, actually the French had come up with the idea, the Germans came through with it and put it, synchronized the propeller with the machine gun, and now you had a good platform to fire a machine gun.
And the last one is Snoopy's nemesis.
The tri-decker. It's a tri-decker and a three-decker and a very flexible airplane. However, the Red Baron didn't get most of his kills in that airplane. He got them in an Albatross.
Oh, yeah.
Albatross 5.
Okay. All right, well, who were some of the pioneers in the early days of?
Oh, we've got a bunch. Well, but not, say a bunch.
After
but
World War I, we had, in World War I, we had Rickenbacker was the ace, as I recall.
Right.
Do you have any other important guys in the Army Air Service or whatever it was?
we have, of course, Billy Mitchell, who, and that's another whole ball game in itself, because he, at that point, was looking for a separate service for the air service in that time.
Even
Brits,
in the 20s, he was looking.
we started a little earlier than that, but because the Brits, as soon as they found out what the capabilities of an airplane was and employing it in tactical situations, they just went straight ahead and formed the RFC, the Royal Flying Corps, and then that transferred about a year later to the RAF, excuse me, which we know today. But we were late.
Yeah. Well, who were some of the pioneers during the period in the 20s and the 30s?
We were going for altitude, speed, and distance. Yeah. That's what the aviation was going for.
So we really were getting into aircraft in the 20s.
Yes, we were. Oh. You take altitude. We had going up in balloon airplanes, go up to 34,000 feet. That's the highest we could get, 34,000. And
now, they didn't have an enclosed cockpit then?
No closed cockpit, and it got cold, and it got freezing. And of course, with the airplane alone, where the turbos enough to get them up, that's it, 34 was there. And then, of course, we went across the United States. First time across the United States. When did we do that? That was going from New York to San Diego, 26 hours and 50 minutes, Lieutenants McCready and Kelly. And then...
now, that was not nonstop, was it?
Oh, yeah, that was nonstop. That's the first nonstop. Oh, people had gone across the United States. That happened in 1911. Cal Perry took a Wright Brothers airplane and flew from New York to Long Beach. Took him 49 days, but and 70 landings, but he made it.
That's about what it took a Conestoga wagon. Huh?
Yeah, right. But he made it going across. And then he got Jimmy Doolittle, famous Jimmy Doolittle. It was a racer, and he took an airplane and won the Schneider Cup Trophy, which was a race with seaplanes. Very ingenious things happened on that airplane. The biggest one was most airplanes that day had a huge radiator out front. They said, hey, wait a minute, let's just put the radiator, we'll mold it into the wing will be the radiator, and we'll lose all that drag and get all that additional lift. So that's for Jimmy Doolittle to that. Well, of course, he went on after that, and first man to do an outside loop, which is quite a strenuous thing on the body. You red out in that, not black out. Yeah. And then, of course, he went on again in 1929. He and Sperry got together, and they took an airplane from Mitchell Field, Long Island, put a hood over his head, over the cockpit, and took off, flew a closed course, and came back and landed all under the cockpit. Had a safety observer also flying alongside. But that was the first blind flying, and which allowed us to fly today.
Yeah, I understand flying in the air under a hood, but on the ground under a hood. Surely he saw the taxi. Surely he took off without a hood on.
No, he took off with the hood on.
He took off with a hood.
Oh, yeah.
And he couldn't see the runway, or did he
Well,
have some?
no, you go straight ahead.
Yeah, that's something.
Well, no, I won't say it's easy, but it's. I've done it. And
Have you done it?
Yeah.
Okay.
You don't. Well, most times, if you're an actual, you can see the runway. But when you're training, you're in the back seat of airplane usually, and you have to keep your heading indicator right on the money.
Yeah.
And stay right down the runway.
Okay. Well, we had quite a few aircraft developed between World War I and World War II. There's a lot of activity, and I was kind of surprised that the fighter aircraft. Let's see some of the next pictures. There, that was what was that?
A-12.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that's sort of like
That coming along.
a little advanced from World War I, but not
Right.
much.
Right.
And let's see the next one.
There's still canvas airplane. First all-metal airplane. This is the P-26. The P-shooter. They call it a P-shooter because it had a sight. You can see this sight on, not from this angle, but there's a sight coming right out of the cockpit. We have that airplane out at the museum.
Do you?
Yeah, it's
Out at Uvar-Hazy?
right, hanging from the ceiling.
So this is a pretty big advancement then.
A big advancement, but one problem they had, and it'll reflect back to the problems the Air Force or the Air Service at that point had, is that no money.
Yeah.
And Congress said that they wanted, the Brits had built a fighter, and Brits fighter had retractable landing gear.
That has some
You
beautiful
notice we have landing gear
pants
on
there.
there, beautiful pants on
Yeah.
the seal, but we didn't have the money to make them hydraulic and come up, and so therefore that's what flew.
Well, the next one, the P-36, I think that does have retractable
P-36,
gear.
they finally, and now all metal also, good airplane.
And that was sort of the forerunner of the P-40, wasn't it? It looks a little like it,
yeah.
except for the nose.
Well, P-40 went into a single inline engine versus a radial
Next
engine.
one, the next picture. That's the P-40.
That's the P-40, Flying
With the
Tiger.
Flying Tiger.
Yeah. Very good airplane for its time. The airplane that leapt off at Pearl Harbor, and Taylor and the other gentleman, I forget his name offhand.
One of the
shot
early
down.
books I read about World War II was by Robert Lee Scott, I think it was, with Chenault's flying.
Yeah, God is my co-pilot.
And
Yeah.
God is my co-pilot, and that was the plane he flew.
Right.
Yeah.
Good airplane.
Yep. Then next we built the P-38.
Yeah.
Next.
Oh, great airplane. The Fork-tailed Devil. The Germans call that the Fork-tailed Devil. It had a tremendous firepower, 120 millimeter cannon, and 4 50s.
Yeah. And the next was a P-39 that came into being in 1941.
Right. This is the one with the Allison mounted behind. Unique concept, which then allowed a big cannon in the nose, a 37 millimeter cannon in the nose, plus some 50s.
And this wasn't used so much during the war by our forces, but more by the Russians. We sold a lot, or gave a lot to the Russians,
Right.
the
And,
Soviets.
The Soviets used them, and it was a great air-to-ground fighter, and it had oxygen problems and going high altitude, but the Russians weren't looking for that. They were looking for tank busters
Yeah.
of the Blitzkrieg coming at them from the west.
And so that cannon in the nose would take care of a tank?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, good.
Well, because you're coming and firing down on the deck at that point.
That's true.
They didn't think about armor plating on the deck.
Yeah. And then we got into transport. We only have a couple of pictures on transport aircraft, but let's see them. That's the Ford Trimotor.
No, I don't think it is. It's another name.
It was called a C3 or the something like that.
It was supposed to be an
The
airplane.
C3, C4. Yeah.
Yeah, it was developed to get into short fields, short landings, and with a load. And the C-123 came along.
Yeah, but that's the Trimotor. Well, next is the C-47,
Yeah,
or the
that-
DC-3.
There's the
And this was
DC-3.
1936. A beautiful airplane for 1936, isn't it?
It was a quantum jump, and it was you said 36 that came out. By 39, 90% of the civilian population were flying in that airplane.
Yeah.
And then, of course, in World War II, over 11,000 were built because we went into the parachute business, and you needed them dropping. And that's where most of
that
the
was the
47
plane that was used on D-Day to drop the troopers.
That's right.
Yeah.
And it was used. It was the only airplane at that point until the C-54 came along.
Well, we need to go on.
Press on.
The bombers, we started developing the bombers. In 1931, we had the B-9. That's next.
That's the B-9, yeah.
And it was short-lived.
Yeah.
But the B-10 came along.
B-10, very good. That's the one
Next
that Hap Arnold took the 10 of them up to long range, all the way up to Alaska and back again. Again, remembering looking for distance. That was done in the late 20s.
And we developed the B-17 in 1938.
There it is. Well, that's a little later one right there, but that's the B-17G with a chin turret. They kept putting different battle stations on
That was probably
airplane.
about 1943, huh?
Yeah.
42, somewhere.
Well,
Anyway.
just the one.
But it was a similar-looking plane. It's just a matter of this was upgraded in many different ways.
Oh, yeah, and all, for instance, the tail, the original airplane didn't have a tail gunner. They put tail gunners on them from then on. They found out there's very vulnerable position.
Okay. Well, we're using up time like crazy, like putting on the afterburner, you know.
Well, that's press on, ask questions.
Well, we started out with the afterburner, I'm afraid.
Yeah, maybe we start there.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's go on. We've got to add some other bombers too. With the B-17, the B-24 is the next aircraft.
Famous airplane, very good airplane.
Yeah, and the B-25.
Could do a lot more than the B-17 and the B-25. If here it is, B-25. Remember Jimmy Doolittle again?
That's the one he
comes
took
back
off
in, took his squadron out there, put it on the aircraft carrier, April 18th, 1942. So that people didn't realize it, and the Japanese didn't know that this was going to happen so quickly after Pearl Harbor.
Yeah, 5 months.
Yep.
And the last one is the B-26.
And that was a great airplane. Jimmy Doolittle, again, they were having problems with that. Young pilots were having problems with that. And so Jimmy Doolittle went down to Tampa, MacDill Air Force Base, and he showed, oh yeah, this is how this airplane goes. And he ran down, took off, shut one engine down on takeoff, and said, see, no problem.
Well, the important thing I think about these pictures is that the last aircraft in each of the categories, the P-38, the P-39, the P-40, were the aircraft that we had just developed at the beginning of World War II.
Right.
And so they ramped up production, and they were brought in fairly quickly. But we really, at the beginning of the war, had some of the older aircraft to try to fight the Zeros and the Messerschmitts and so forth.
Well, we didn't have many.
Yeah.
The P-51 hadn't quite get there. The P-47 hadn't quite got there. Those were the big fighters.
Yeah, but so they had developed them because they saw, I presume, the war coming.
Well, they were under development, right?
Yeah.
A lot of stuff started beforehand, and of course, for us in the United States, Europe was already in war, and that was getting things rolling in the States fast.
Well, let's take a look at the next pictures.
The B-29.
This is the only one that was developed during the war.
Yeah, and came in during the war. And the primary mission that was in the Manhattan Project, it was a silver, and that airplane was designated to drop the bomb on
to drop the atomic bomb.
First one. Yeah.
And the next picture.
And the P-47, the Jug, really a great ground airplane, 6.4 and firing 50s.
Yeah.
If you can imagine, that's 36 rounds on board.
And the next airplane.
Oh, the P-51, a great airplane also. And especially with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine built in Detroit by Packard, which gave it ability to, that engine worked well up 40,000 feet. So,
And the P-61, next aircraft.
Yeah, that's two R-2800 engines. First airplane ever designed for radar and night capability, which it was. 4 20-millimeter cannons and 4 .50 caliber machine guns. Great firepower.
Okay, well so those are the aircraft that we had in World War II. What a change from World War I, where we had nothing, to we really led the world in aircraft. Although perhaps the Germans had developed some sophisticated aircraft, the Messerschmitt and the jets. But we brought in the jet at the end of the...
We didn't have anything.
Yeah.
We never got a jet. The Germans did. The Germans had two active, one of them's the ME-263, which was a twin-engine jet airplane, and of course the Arado also a reconnaissance, a bomber reconnaissance, multi-placed airplane.
Okay, so at the end of World War II, we have a large organization as the Air Force. It still was under the Army Chief of Staff.
Correct.
And so now those people who really were looking to get into a separate service were crying even more or yelling even more to be a separate service.
That's
how
right.
How did it happen? What happened after World War II?
Well, after World War II, they found out that the Air Force was really bigger than they thought it was. I mean, it was huge. They just said, we have to divide these resources, and they were saying, hey, wait a minute, the Brits have the RAF, the French had their Armée de l'Air. Why don't we become the Air Force? So we were the U.S. Army Air Force. We just became the U.S. Army Air Force, USAF, and that was in 1947, as you said, and that then made us a separate service and doing the mission of flying.
So the significance then of changing from the Army Air Force to the U.S. Air Force was really the mission of you had your own mission, you had your own people.
Right.
You had money.
Well, that was always a problem.
Well, and of course the size of the organization.
Right.
But money probably was the most important of those, huh?
Well, that's one of course, this all came out of the famous Key West Agreement in 1947. Harry Truman liked Key West, when he got all those military leaders down there, and they said, okay, this is going to be our roles and mission. And that's when he said, Air Force, you're separate, and you go your way. And I think probably the Army was the problems came in as well, that we can't fly. Well, you can fly this. The roles and missions were designed and designated in that time frame.
And the changes since 1947, the Air Force has gotten into space, it's gotten into missiles,
right?
It's special ops, the drones. So the Air Force has really sort of, and it's the principal nuclear, for the land forces. Of course, we still have the sea nuclear forces, but it's the air nuclear force with the Minuteman missile and the B-52 bomber. We don't have much time left. Suppose we run through the pictures that we have of aircraft, and we won't talk about them very much. Let's start with it. Okay, that's the B-36.
B-36, when first came out, it didn't have the jet engines, the 4 jet engines on there, but they put that on there. It really made it a great airplane.
So the next aircraft is
well, that's an F-84 trying to land on a B-36.
Okay.
They'd be in the sling there. It worked, but then logistics became too complicated.
The next one?
That's a B-47. That's one of our first jet bombers, really a slick airplane.
And it lasted about 10 years. The B-52 was next in 1955.
Well, that's a tanker, though. You got on there.
Well, let's get to the B-52.
There's the B-52, okay, and that dropping a load of bombs, and that's still going today. It's one of our first land portions of the triad.
I had the tanker on there because that was a refueling, which was very important for both the B-47 and or all of the aircraft now, or not
there
all
it is again. That structures our whole raison d'etre, how and where can we go, distance. And that was first started by Tui Spatz, who became the first Chief of Staff of the Air Force.
The next aircraft is the B-58.
Yep.
Yep.
That was short-lived.
Then the FB-111. Well, that was a supersonic. The FB-111 became a major.
Right. It was a great airplane used in
And the B-1, the next
Vietnam. B-1 is in being right today.
And the next one is the B-2.
And that's a whole unique concept, Northrop concept, the flying wing.
Yep. Okay, let's go to the next pictures.
An F-80, that's the first fighter I flew.
That was the first. That was the first major jet fighter too.
Yeah, yeah.
The Air Comet didn't really pan out, did it?
No, the Air
B-59.
Comet was really a test bed.
Okay, the next one is the F-84s,
Yep,
and then the F-86s. That's John's plane.
yeah. Oh yeah, great airplane. That's, imagine a second lieutenant flying the fastest airplane in the world at the time.
The F-100. Next plane.
Yeah, that's a Hun, and that could go straight and level, go through supersonic.
And F-101, the Voodoo.
Yeah, that was short-lived. Great recce bird too.
And the F-105.
And that was the Thud. And it was a backbone of our action in northern Vietnam.
And the next one, F-4.
And very universal airplane, one of the first ones that the Navy used, we used.
And it was a workhorse there.
It was a good airplane.
And the next one, the F-15.
And I
Came out in '75.
surprisingly enough, that's about to go out of the inventory.
Well, this was introduced though in '75.
Oh yeah, yeah.
So that's 32 years ago.
Yep.
And the F-16
Yeah.
came out in
Very good airplane.
'78. The F-22.
22 is on them in squadrons today, and it's one of the first line fighters as the F-35 comes up.
And the F-35.
And there it is coming on board. Talked to a person the other day. He actually had 150 hours in that airplane already. So they're coming into squadrons. It's quite an airplane, a whole different concept.
Well, John, we've seen going from the Wright brothers warped wing aircraft to the Spirit and the F-35,
Yeah.
which is a short takeoff and landing, which is a
Well, that's the
super-
B model, but it can. The Marines
three
are
different
getting
models,
that
I
one.
understand.
Yeah.
But we've seen a tremendous change, and we've seen it during the period '47 to now. What a difference it has been.
Well, it's,
Of course, that's
the whole roles
70
and
years
missions
ago.
changed also.
Yeah.
Being now where the Air Force is not fighting outfit, it's supplies, supplies forces to fight. That came out of the Goldwater-Nichols Act, 1986, combined forces, and which then helped smooth our whole fighting force of the.
Well, 28 minutes goes very fast. Can you
What-
believe it?
Is it only 20 minutes?
So thank you very much for coming on today. I appreciate it.
Well, I appreciate that, and I enjoy it.
I enjoyed talking with you because I was in the Army, but I really did a lot of.
Well, you got an aeronautical engineering degree. You should know something about airplanes.
Well, yeah, I have a master's in aerospace engineering, and I taught aerodynamics too. But that's all today, folks. So let's have a couple of announcements.